Now is we'll have Geeta and Manu in conversation, but we are hoping, because there are a lot of people here who know a lot of history, who know a lot of the family, who know a lot of what it meant to have a person like Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in public life through those years. We are hoping that we'll pass the mic around, and if you can, it doesn't have to be questions, of course, but if you can contribute to the conversation, it will be very welcome. So we'll start with the two of you.
Thank you, Manu. It's been a pleasure to, I mean, I've only just had a copy of the book in my hands in the last week or so, but I've seen you develop the ideas through lectures and other means. And I want to start with a couple of thoughts, which I'd like to bear in mind when I'm asking specific questions. So one of the I think very extraordinary things about your book is your development of the thesis that through biography, not through other kinds of explication or analysis, is that Vijay Lakshmi Pandit had a distinct internationalist vision. That's what you just said in your lecture. And in fact, Manu met my mother in the last few days, and my mother has, of course, as you all know, promoted Nehruvian ideas, secularism, and non-violence. And she said to Manu that my mother, went out and promoted the things that were laid down by Nehru and Gandhi. And you very politely disagreed with her and said she was her own woman. And so I want to try and explore with you why, when she was as extraordinary as she was, and as well known, I mean, people still know her name, even if they know little else, why she, who came from this very elite and articulate background, seems also to be subjected to what the social and socialist historian E.P. Thompson called the enormous condescension of history, when he was talking about the laboring peoples, the unsung people who left no records or any official records and so on, and how you had to recover their histories and their stories from all manner of sources. And yet, as you found, there's a wealth of information, and yet you really are the first person who's put it all together.
Well, thank you. It has been a task, it's true, although a pleasure to do it. There's some ironies in this situation. At Murthy, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's papers are extensive and constitute perhaps one of the most extensive collections in the archive, save perhaps for, save for Krishna Menon's, which have just been opened and which I think are even more so. But up until this most recent thing, I think Vijay Lakshmi's was one of the biggest paper collections there. People had certainly gone through it for all manners of things, and she would be cited here and there, but it wasn't really subjected to serious analysis or taken as a source in its own right for the purpose of interrogating her specifically. And why that is I think is quite interesting in its own right and complicated. Firstly, it has to do with the kind of archive she produced. She was a deep thinker, and so on the issue of what your mother had said, Nehru is frequently thought of as the intellectual force. He's produced all these books on a variety of topics to do with all kinds of things. And so people rightly go to those and sort of explicate his thought through that. Vijay Lakshmi did not write books of that kind. She didn't write philosophies or treatises on foreign policies. She wrote a number of books, but they were all experiential in nature, about the things that she did, her time as a minister, her time in prison, and so on. She produced a lot of paper, though, and the paper in total matches what many men also produced. But she produced this paper in the form of letters and diaries, notes, And so I think part of this has to do...
Speeches.
And many speeches. And part of this, part of the problem of the archive has to do with the nature of what this is and how easy it is to dismiss this as not being serious, as opposed to these larger tomes. And that, I think, is a very gendered way of approaching this question, because I think that there are all kinds of reasons why one might write in this way. Going through that material took a lot of time, but I found very clear lines of thought, detailed, distinguished, independent of Nehru and Gandhi, and often in conflict with them. And that's really what's important, because it's not that she's just checking a box, always agreeing with them. She disagrees, and in many cases she disagrees about ideas while they're being formulated. And so when we track those lines of thought, I find it now hard to say that Nehru or Gandhi are the people, well, not so much Gandhi, but Nehru is so much the person who just did this. There's a conversation, an interactive conversation going on between them, and I think there's a very different kind of origin story in terms of intellectual thought here that still needs to be worked out. My book, in that sense, is just a first step, and there are some people here in the front row who I expect very much to take that forward in the coming years. So that's one part of it. The other has to do with, I think, the kind of paternalism and patriarchy she faced throughout her life itself, some of which I indicated. When I encountered people who knew her to this day, and some people who worked with her and had memories, some of the recollections could often be very dismissive, dismissing her for frivolity, for example. This didn't really comport with what the record I found showed, and so I could really only chalk this up to, again, very patronizing and paternalistic kinds of approaches to things. I'll give you just one example, which is, as you may know, she frequently wore sleeveless blouses. And so this one person who was telling me about her career in diplomacy, and that was what I thought the discussion was going to involve, said that what her great contribution was, quote, that I'm quoting this other person now, and their recollection, was her fine arms.
Really sexist.
Yes, exactly. So, and that is what she faced in her own life, in the memory of her life, in the memory of her contributions, and that is what has to be overcome. So I think there's all of that part of it. Then I think thirdly, just the two remaining points on this issue. Thirdly, I think there's a great men's school of history, which has focused on men and not women. That's a whole other thing. And then finally, of course, there is an active erasure that took place because she went up against Indira Gandhi, because they led to conflict. There was a kind of purposeful erasure of her thereafter that scrubbed her from the public record, even insofar as the history of Anand Bhavan goes. If you go to Anand Bhavan, where she lived and spent so much time, grew up, she's hardly there. She's a ghost at Anand Bhavan. It's crazy. So I think those are the reasons altogether that we find this.
Yeah, she wasn't consulted when it was turned into a museum.
Stepping for a second as a complete outsider of this whole thing and reading the book, I actually found it fascinating that through the book, you see a woman not apologetic at all about being a woman. I mean, in a lot of the women's movement that came up after that, we had to fight we had to say that, you had to, in a sense, have to give up some of what being a woman was for women. And you read this book and you think she never apologized for being a woman. She was all woman, which meant that the way she looked at a problem, and it made me wonder what it would have been like if we had had many more women like this. I don't know if many could have existed, but the way she looked at the Bengal famine and what she thought she needed to do. It wasn't just making public policy, it wasn't asking people to do things. She got down to the ground, she needed to keep going back there, she needed to set things up when she asked people to contribute, she said, contribute so that it can be done, because there are children who are lying around with nobody there. People are dying, all around, and we need to do this. When she went to the Kumbh Mela, the way she handled the health crisis, it seemed very different from what you hear men do. I was thinking of a number of things. When she went into prison, she was looking at the children who were there and saying, why are these children in prison? They need something different. And the idea of working on a garden when she was there, nowhere do you need to see her get out of who she is for her to do what she has to do. When she's at the UN, when she's a minister, it seemed to make no difference. I think that's what fascinated me about this. It was really so different from reading any other biography, for this reason. I mean, among many other reasons, but this certainly was one reason. So, she did have, plainly she had, it's also fabulous to see the relationship the siblings had, even when they didn't agree and even when they had their problems. But there was no imposition of an idea one on the other. And there was a lot of give and take between Nehru and Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, for instance. But it's so rich, and the kind of public engagement that existed. It's this book that tells us how much there was in private life too, and how many conversations. I mean, the children around you discussing not India, not colonization, not the British, but the world. And you open it out to the world. The wealth of that, I think we've lost sight of it in much of the history that the way we read history, and this produces that. And she helps produce it. I mean, if she weren't there, this history perhaps would have to be said differently.
Well, my mother always said it was the men in the family who were feminists. So,
having said this, I just have to say, he starts his book with saying this is not a hagiography. What I said just sounded like it was, but it's not. I think it's a biography written with a lot of affection, and she produces that affection. That's the.
I do want to say that I'm a professional historian, not a biographer. And so when I came to this and I started going through her life story, what it seemed to me I was doing was writing a history of the 20th century. She lived for almost all of it. And a history specifically of India in the world in the 20th century. What struck me was that I was covering a number of things that seemed very familiar to me. That is, okay, I have to walk through some of the big grand events of this well-known period of history. And yet, in each instance in which I found myself walking alongside her, the story was completely different from what I knew. It just read very differently. And it read very differently because who was acting, who was seeing, who was doing and reacting, all was completely, it's not so much the reverse, but just, it's an alternate universe altogether of this story we think we know. And that story involves a series of world wars, it involves a Cold War, it involves the independence of the subcontinent, it involves the making of a post-colonial country, and it involves international diplomacy, a world order. It goes on and on and on. And so it's striking to me how truly seeing, it's like a cliche come true, seeing things through new eyes changes the path that we walk.
And on that note, I mean, listening to you, I mean, when you began to talk about some of your findings, I remember very distinctly a lecture you gave, and it was actually for a sort of cross-country project on global biography, if I remember. And I mean, that you would think might be the perfect place to talk about, all her diplomatic achievements and, some of these very big, grand achievements. And you gave her CV, as it were, in a paragraph, all the first this and first that. And then you concentrated on talking about her time as health minister. And I remember this very clearly because this was, we were on Zoom. You were probably in your living room. The world had closed down. I was sitting with my mother at home. We had been completely isolated for months and months at that time. and the funeral pyres were burning 24/7, and the Kumbh Mela had been declared open. And you talked about how she dealt with a cholera epidemic and went to the Kumbh Mela to deal with that. And my hair was standing on end. So I'd like you to just describe that a little bit.
She's the health minister. She goes to the Kumbh Mela in Haridwar, and she's very excited to go, although the versions of this where she's from, but this feels very different to her. And she gets very excited, and when she gets there, something about it, she describes it almost as the scales falling from her eyes as she sees a lot of people there with true mission and intent, but just a lot of con men also operating, and she's very wary of that. So once that happens, she kind of approaches things with fresh eyes, and she gets down to business fairly fast. She warns people of cholera. She's herself protected, and she starts to try to take some protective measures. But even with the protective measures that are taken, both for herself and for the place at large, cholera begins to spread very rapidly, and people begin to pass off. She basically then, and the cholera spreads everywhere. It's a terrifying moment. People are dying. They're in wide numbers, and she grabs the people in charge of her staff and marches right in to the most deadly areas, trying to get people the need and assistance that they want. It's an act of supreme courage, and she doesn't just do it once. She does it for an extensive period of time. She has some protection, but what is some protection against cholera at that point, especially if you keep getting overwhelmed by it? She works herself to sickness. The sickness is not cholera. It's total, absolute exhaustion, which itself can be quite deadly. And she helps to contain it and to push it back. And it is quite a feat. It is a personal effort by a health minister and to push back and contain a public epidemic. And it felt like it was speaking to the present as we did that in the middle of the COVID pandemic.
I think in every other page of this book, Manu has really recovered her voice. My mother had her brother's letters to her, Nehru's letters to her in her possession, and she edited and published those. But we didn't have the answers, and the answers were scattered through various places. She didn't have any research support. She's not a scholar. She did use the archives, and she did build something up, but she was always looking, mostly because her personal information was what came to her, that is, Nehru's letters inward, as it were. And so it was wonderful to actually recover my grandmother's voice and to see what she said in her own voice at crucial moments. And so one area that I just want to go to, which you referred to, the aftermath of. You talked about the reaction to her victory at the UN General Assembly, even before India had become independent, when she led a debate on South Africa and defeated General Smuts. Now, this is not a story we didn't know. I grew up with this story. I grew up, and I'm sure all of us will remember, that she had done this debate and she had defeated Smuts. But the spin, as it were, or the version of the story that we heard, was that Gandhiji had said, you must conduct yourself without insult. You must be polite to Smuts. We are opposing him, but he is my friend, and you must always conduct yourself with honor. So this sort of Gandhian spin, as it were, was of ethical conduct was the chief thing that I embraced or carried away with me for years and years and years. And it was only when I read actually your book, The Peacemakers, where you discuss this in some detail about the founding of the UN and Vijay Lakshmi's role in the founding of the UN, but also in this debate, and also talk about Hansa Mehta and other remarkable women who were involved with that process. But it's only then, and I've worked in human rights in an international organization for years, and we had spent years discussing universal jurisdiction And we had spent years discussing whether, I mean, Western human rights was conceived very differently, with a very firm disregard for economic and social rights and an embrace only of civil and political rights, and only conceived in certain ways and so on. And yet, at the founding of human rights, there were other conceptions of it. So both human rights in general, but also this idea that one state could not only defend itself against aggression, but was able to raise a moral argument against the conduct of another state towards people living in its territory. I won't say citizens, because many of them were explicitly non-citizens, or were being made non-citizens. And of course they'd been aware of this because of colonialism on the one hand, but also fascism on the other. So how do you take that forward? I mean, in the biography, because of course she was involved, not just at that debate, but for a considerably longer time, in both in South Africa itself and the question of South Africa, but also other issues of where you actually speak to the words of the Charter, to the intentions of the UN, rather than deals that are done, realpolitik deals between states.
I think this is one of the differences we can see between a biography and a monograph, a thesis-driven book like my previous one, The Peacemakers. So in that one, I was making a claim about India's internationalist vision and foreign policy, and what it hoped to accomplish on that stage. And I followed a sequence of events that sort of led from one place to the other, and they followed on one another. What you're asking here is, so here's one of the actors, and they have this they play a role in this pivotal moment, and it has an impact. But what is the teleology of thought, of action that brings her to that moment, and then what happens thereafter, after this pivotal moment? And does she continue how does she intersect with the changes that have been wrought? So that's what I'm able to do in this biography, which is you can follow this in all kinds of ways. So to the point you're asking about it, there's a couple things there. The first is that the great achievement of her life was this moment. She recalled this about 2 decades later in a BBC interview with Mark Tully, where she was asked to pick one thing. That was the time of her life, obviously the important things that happened after this moment of the interview, but at that moment in the 60s, she declared that what she accomplished in 1946 was the singular achievement of her life. And it was because she goes to the United Nations, which has been new, and she previously gone to the United Nations as part of the San Francisco conference to help establish the new institution. There she'd gone at the urging of W.E.B. Du Bois and Walter White at the NAACP, and she'd gone to lead a counter-delegation to San Francisco. As part of that counter-delegation, she articulated then an alternate vision for what the UN would be, and she confronted British officials who had a different kind of perspective. The British officials won, and they won by putting in a certain kind of language into the charter. That language was delicately phrased, so it was a bit ambiguous. They celebrated that ambiguity because it allowed for what they wanted, which was the continuation of colonialism under the language of trusteeship. She felt she'd lost, but she came back at this and then turned that logic of ambiguity on its head. Ambiguity in language, whatever the British intent might have been, meant that you could also interpret it in the way that how they got away with it, which is it meant there were possibilities. So she used that to articulate a much wider celebratory kind of vision and pushed back then against South Africa on that basis. South Africa had passed a series of discriminatory laws, and she was trying to challenge those. She did that by winning a 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly, which was celebrated, and then I talked in my remarks about how the black press and W.E.B. Du Bois specifically then recognized the value of that achievement as smashing white supremacy. But that specific moment of victory wasn't just a vote in the General Assembly. It established a precedent. The precedent was that the United Nations or the international community had a right to intervene in the domestic affairs of states. And that Article 2.7 of the new UN Charter didn't prevent that, the domestic jurisdiction clause. So that's the specific kind of consequence of that. That opens the door to all of human rights. The Human Rights Commission, when it's then created shortly thereafter, is charged on the basis of the fact that this precedent has been set by her in the debate just prior. But now, having established that, then there's, okay, great, the UN can intervene, and now we develop something called human rights, and then there's what happens, there's the reality of the Cold War. And different sides have very contesting views as to what a right means, which right is acceptable, which isn't, and it turns out that a lot of that can be chalked up to power politics. They just get, they're defined by, pushed through power politics. So she has to navigate those things. And so while I think the Peacemakers lays out a claim about policy at a very sort of intellectual level, this is about the reality of how you implement those views. And it comes face to face with poor decision making, with people who say one thing and do another, etc.
Because you spoke about human rights, and I was thinking we know that right now there are all kinds, for some time now, we have this idea that human rights are something that has come from the West and is being imposed on us. But everything I read in the book said that she had thought about it, spoken about it, advocated for it. And I was thinking the idea that colonizers and the imperialists would be looking at human rights and not those who had been colonized now seems so absurd after reading this book. That prompts me to ask a question, because there's a lot in the book where you speak about patriarchy. I don't know if you ever encountered the word patriarchy in any of those documents that you saw. I just wondered, in the way in which you've written the book and the way in which you thought about what you were reading, how much do you think was influenced by what you're seeing around us now? I don't mean that anything is an anachronism or anything, but then, the language that you give to it, the way in which you interpret what you think is being said, do you think it had any role at all? I know you're trained and you perhaps started working your way out of it. I was just curious.
All history speaks to the present. Historians, our work is to think about the past in the context, a lens of what we do. Now there are schools of thought. There's what's called a presentist school, which makes this claim. There's people who disagree with that. But any work which has, to me, meaning speaks to our present. It can have a long life. It can be written in a way that the notion of the nature of the present can have a durability. But it must be able to speak to the now. I will say, there is a moment which I'll just illustrate here to say that I definitely did that purposefully. It's meant to speak to the now, and again, a long now, not just a moment of this particular second. But there's a moment when she is a minister and she goes on the radio, and she gives the most remarkable speech because, in the field of women's history, as it has developed, at least in the West, it grew out of a specific article by a scholar named Barbara Welter. She wrote an article called The Cult of True Womanhood. That famous article then grew into a phrase that we call the cult of domesticity, widely known. The cult of true womanhood talks about the several key values that women were expected to adhere to. Most of them, they were relegated to the domestic sphere, the sphere of the home. And it's what defined a true woman in the Americas in the 19th century. And from that grew the contemporary field of women's history in the West. I'm looking at this speech by Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in the 1930s. Sorry, Barbara Welter, who wrote that article, is my mentor. She recently passed away, but I worked with her, knew her very, very well. And I value her work, her contributions, and I adore her as a person. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in the 1930s, somehow she's speaking on the radio using language that's so strikingly similar. I couldn't even believe it as I was listening to us. So listening to this, and then I thought I might have like crossed my wires and gotten something that, as I reading about the speech. So there is, it's not just me making that connection, it is there. And I was struck as I was reading it by how much the story speaks to the present, independent of my intentions. It just feels very relevant and timely.
So I'm going to come back to this sometime because I do understand the past speaks to the present. I want to know how much the present spoke to how you read the past. But because just, you know, like I wasn't very sure that this really fitted into the rest of your narrative. It has place here, but when you're talking about FDR's 4 principles, which is freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want, I felt it was today's making you speak about some parts of that period, and that you would, that's, maybe I'm reading it like that because that's what I'm seeing, but I just wonder, should we send it around and then we can come back to both of you? Each.